Welcome. Hope y'all can hear me. This is Billy Tarrant, Associate Director for Stewardship Services at Borderlands Research Institute. And this is our first attempt at BRI with a webinar. If we have a few glitches tonight, it won't be for a lack of preparation and practice. We've been trying our best. We appreciate y'all joining us tonight. We are very lucky to have a fantastic presentation this evening. I'll talk about in a moment. First of all, I want to inform you of some of our upcoming webinars as well. We have this one tonight. Y'all may remember, some of y'all that came to our webinar in the fall. We started off that series and then immediately ended up with a significant weather event last year that shut us down on this particular webinar, Development by Design. And then after that, COVID hit, and we've been in the same situation since, and we've opted to go to a webinar-based format. We did a little reboot on some of our other ones, but this one's extremely important, and this is the one that we're going to learn a lot about what exactly this process is. I know that y'all have a lot of questions about exactly what Respect Big Bend is about and what how it can help guide energy development. So if you look at the, by the way, October 8th, we have Landowners, Energy Development and Conflict, Finding Common Ground. Our speakers there, David Yates with the TWA, Chris West with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, and Chase Curry, who is a general manager at the San Pedro Ranch. They have done so much down there with great conservation work in cooperation with energy development. That's going to be a great one. And exactly the one there at the last is myself and Dr. Lewis Harbison, Conservation Values and Strategies for the Last Frontier. I don't want to undersell that one either. I'll be there, but hopefully Harbison will pick up my slack and we'll have a great presentation there as well. So when you go to ask questions, we're going to say questions to the very end. We'll have both of our speakers, Dr. Joe Keysecker and Melinda Taylor, online for a panel question type format. And then we'll also have one of our esteemed SAG members, our Stakeholder Advisory Group, who is helping guide this process in the Tri-County area as well. And so I'll introduce that individual here pretty soon. But when you go to ask a question, anytime during these presentations, go down to that little question mark box at the bottom there, and it says question and answer. You type in your question there, and we'll get those to our panelists for the last section of our webinar tonight. Hopefully within a week or so, we'll post this presentation, this webinar, on the Respect Big Bend website, along with any questions we don't get to. So feel free to ask questions there. I want to go ahead and introduce our speakers. Dr. Joseph Keysicker is a lead scientist for the Nature Conservancy's Global Land and Water Conservation Program. He is a leader in developing guidance to balance energy and infrastructure demands with environmental conservation. He has also been at the forefront of moving development and mitigation planning to a landscape scale. He pioneered the Conservancy's development by design approach, an initiative that seeks to improve development planning through the incorporation of predictive modeling to provide solutions that benefit conservation goals and development objectives. He directs the implementation in over a dozen countries around the world. We're very lucky to have him. He's helping guide this process as one of our coalition partners. Melinda Taylor is a senior lecturer at the University of Texas School of Law, where she teaches courses on environmental and energy law, including the environmental impacts of energy development. She founded the K. Bailey Hutchinson Center for Energy Law and Business and was the first executive director of the center. Prior to UT Law, Melinda directed the Ecosystem Research Program for the Environmental Defense Fund. She's the one that keeps us all moving in this right direction for those of us that are on the support team for Respect Big Bend. And I believe it's my turn to go ahead and kick it to Joe.
Great. I'm assuming everybody can see my screen. Fantastic. Well, first, let me say it's a pleasure to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity to get a chance to share a little bit of the work that I do with you all, and especially after hours. So hopefully this will be fun in addition to being semi-educational. A little bit about how we're going to do this. I'm going to focus on giving you an overview of what we refer to as development by design is all about. And then I'm going to kick it over to Melinda to go into a little bit of detail about how we're trying to morph and apply it in West Texas through the RBB process. So I'm going to start off with a little bit of doom and gloom. This is actually from a paper I published with some colleagues literally last week, and it looks at the amount of human modification across the globe literally around the last 30 years from 1990, pre-internet, to give you a sense of the scale. Big picture, there's about 1.6 million square kilometers of natural land that we've lost. Put that in perspective, that's the size of Alaska. 178 square kilometers daily. So if you think about that over just the course of 5 days, that would be roughly the size of Dallas every 5 days that we've converted over the last, again, 30 years. And about 12 hectares a minute. So that's about 12 baseball fields every minute. And so, I don't want to emphasize the doom part of this, but I really just wanted to give you a sense of the scale, but really the rate, because one of the findings from our study was that rate is actually increasing. So that rate of loss is accelerating as we've moved across time, and it's likely to continue. And I want to emphasize the rate as I go forward. Let's see, there we go. So this is actually an animation of nighttime lights from the Bakken, which loops through 4 years from 2007 to 2011. And so what you're looking at is in this upper left-hand part that you're seeing this sort of bright increase in light is that Bakken formation. And so this area, if you've ever been there, was a sleepy agricultural area. And I'd like to say overnight, 4 years went from a sleepy agricultural area to a large-scale industrial development. And just to put it into scale, if you look at that last sort of patch of nighttime lights, a lot of that's from flaring. It's on the scale of Minneapolis, which is that big bright city light that you see right there. So the reason to sort of highlight this is I want to emphasize that as these kinds of development waves come, they often are going to touch down in rural communities. And how are these rural communities supposed to adapt and deal with that sort of explosion of development? So if we look going forward, the projections are likely over the next future 30 years, from 2020 to 2050, we're going to see huge increases in population and GDP. People that are below the poverty line in developing countries now are going to be at middle-class standards of living. They're going to consume more water, more food, more energy. And Texas is one of those supply houses for energy in particular. A lot of the energy that's developed is being shipped out of the US to some of these markets that are increasing. I want to call attention particularly to energy because that's going to be the biggest driver of land use change in the United States. Has been for the last almost decade and will certainly be for decades coming forward. A term that we call energy sprawl. How does changing and shifting energy demand increase the need and demand for land that's going to be dedicated to energy development? A lot of factors are driving this. Some pictures, one of these that you're likely familiar with in the upper left is from the Permian Basin. This is down in southwest Wyoming and the forested areas from Pennsylvania. Market forces are really responsible, I think, largely for the shift from coal to natural gas, which has really knocked coal out of the top spot for electricity generation. And same on the renewable side, market forces are driving the push to generate electricity more from renewables. Texas is the hot spot for both natural gas and oil, shale gas production, as well as renewable energy, both wind and I think solar is on the, will soon be one of the top producers for solar as well. Both of those energy types, natural gas, and renewable energy, the reality is they take more space. They're going to take more land. So we have to be conscious of that as we move forward. The way that we plan for development is fundamentally broken. And I say that with a huge amount of confidence. Pretty much everywhere in the world uses a process that originated in the United States in the late 60s, early 70s. And at the core of that is environmental impact assessment. So when there's a proposed development that goes through a process of planning for what those impacts might look like and attempting to mitigate them. But it's done at a scale that doesn't make sense, and it's done in a manner in terms of timing that's usually very reactive. These are 3 places around the world where we've done development by design projects. This is in the Uinta Basin in Utah. This is in the Gobi Desert in Mongolia. It's a mine site with partnership between Rio Tinto and the Mongolian government. The other is another mining area, Great Western Woodlands. A lot of the world's gold comes out of this area. All 3 of the projects, the companies and the regulators that were involved, were trying to do something above and beyond what is currently required for the regulatory process. But again, the lens they were placing on this was the site, the place where the development's happening. But when you put it into context, and now this snaps in all the other development leases, clearly, even those best intentions to do something really good is going to miss the cumulative impacts. And again, that temporal scale of planning for development once the investments are made are really going to put us on our back foot and make it really difficult for us to get the best outcomes that we might want to see. So what needs to change? Well, simply what I refer to as we need to go big and we need to go early. So we need to move away from these site-based planning projects to more broader landscape scales to get at those cumulative impacts. And we need to go much earlier. We need to be figuring out where development is likely to go, what those cumulative impacts are, and how we can plan for them, ways to mitigate those impacts, not on a site-by-site basis. So development by design is at the core of it is to try to bring those solutions that it's not development or conservation, it's development and conservation. So we wholly recognize the benefits of development, from economic development, jobs, to human health benefits in terms of infrastructure and a variety of other things. But I think the way we're planning for it is broken. We're building our landscapes without a blueprint. You would never build a house without a blueprint, but that's exactly how we're building our landscapes, without a vision and a plan for how we want them to look. So at the core of what we do at DVD is to create a conservation vision. And science can inform that, conservation science, but it's really it's a community decision, or it's the people that live and work in that landscape that have to provide that impact for that conservation vision. And I'll show some example. I'll show one example, and Melinda will talk about another with the RBB work. We need to make some attempt to understand what the future development footprint looks like. And so we can't wait until someone's proposing a development. We have to try our best to project what future patterns are going to look like. Estimate then how that future development footprint might impact or prevent us from realizing that conservation vision, and then apply appropriate mitigation actions in ways that can minimize those impacts. In some cases, maybe move them around, avoid them, or compensation. Use the tools in the mitigation hierarchy from avoid, minimize, restore, and offset. So I'm going to walk through really quick an example from the Central Appalachians. So this may look somewhat familiar, different landscape, but an unconventional oil and gas well. Everything about unconventional oil and gas well is bigger than conventional. Bigger drills, bigger drill pads, more water, bigger pipelines. And you're probably familiar with some of the goings on in the Central Appalachian area. This is actually a picture from Pennsylvania. When we first started the project, the first thing we did was ask people what they cared about. We did this through a variety of different mechanisms. One was surveys that went out, hired independent companies to take polls and surveys, and then did scores of town halls and engagements, not me personally, but my colleagues that work for the Nature Conservancy in these areas. And the number one thing we heard from people when we asked them what they cared about or what they were most worried about with the development was the surface drinking water, both the amount and quality. And so this area, it's a big area, it's about over 40 million acres, is where some of our largest population centers are, from New York down to Washington, D.C. And about 20 million people rely on surface water for their drinking supply. It's also a heavily forested area, which is why Nature Conservancy is very interested in it, because it's also important for biodiversity. But as we went through this process, it was clear what we needed to do was, as we started to look at future development, translate that into the currency and impacts that the people that live there care about. So we start with this. This dark area is the focus of the shale gas development. We knew at that time about where 8,000 plus wells were drilled, and we also knew where about 6,000 additional wells have been permitted. We then used those as inputs into a statistical model, so we could characterize those areas by essentially their below ground features, their geology, that helped us understand where development was likely to go in the future. And we built a predictive model. This is a really quick summary of that probability surface. But again, for this, the black lines are that high pressurization area that I showed you in gray. And you're not seeing the sort of significant amount of variation from high to low. But with this probability surface, then we could start to assign footprints on the ground to look at different ways the development might happen. We actually knew how much footprint there is associated with each well pad, associated infrastructure, what some of the indirect impacts were. We did this both for wind and solar, but I'm really probably just going to focus more on the shale gas. It's easier to tell the story. It's a little too complicated to try to bring in the two sectors, but essentially we were able to then assign those onto the ground. And hopefully my animation will. There we go. So what this is going to loop through is an animation that the smallest amount of color that you're seeing on that blue map was essentially the 2006 starting point. And then each subsequent move up where there's essentially more stuff on the map is a different scenario. One is from 2006 to 2010, how much impact there's been over that time. And then the other two are looking at two different scenarios. I want to explain to you, though, what the map is actually showing. This is using an impervious cover model, so the areas in blue are what we call as sensitive watersheds, and it's looking at these for really small scale hucks or watersheds. About 8,000 plus acres is the size. So the ones that are blue are what we call sensitive. They're really in good shape. A lot of forest cover, no impervious cover, or very little impervious cover, and they function really well. As you move up the chain from this sort of gray-green to then orange and to red, what you're getting is an increase in impervious cover and a reduction in function of that watershed. And so we obviously were interested in how that's changed from past to present when we were doing our modeling. We also wanted to look at were there interventions that we could deploy that might reduce those impacts. And so one of the really simple things that we looked at was just what's the difference if we drilled 8 wells per pad versus 4 wells per pad. And across this landscape, it varied greatly from 2 to 12 in terms of how many wells were being drilled. But just simply to be able to look at how that variation might impact things to target where development is likely to go based on our predictive model and what those differences in footprint might do. So it helps then users to target places where interventions are going to be needed. Where might we need to reduce that impervious cover? Are there ways to move around those footprints in order to reduce that impact that it's likely to have on water quality? I don't think I made it clear, but impervious cover is just, pushed, it's cement, it's hard structures, it's dirt roads where the soils are compacted. And the reason that's important is because when it rains, and it rains a fair bit in this area, in this landscape, if without a natural cover, that water just essentially runs off. It takes with it sediment, in some cases takes with it other pollutants, and puts them into the waterways. Again, that could impair the surface drinking water, which 20 million people in this landscape are dependent on. So we could use this simulation to target where interventions may go. If you're interested in this, it's actually featured in a chapter in a book, and I'm gonna ask, if you're interested, please let Billy or Lewis or Destiny, or put your mailing address if you have that ability in the chat. Happy to send you a copy. We just closed our office, and my wife is gonna kill me if I don't get the pile of books that I have in the garage out of there. So if you're doing me a favor, if you're interested, I'm happy to send a copy. I'm gonna stop there, and I'm gonna turn it over to Melinda, and she's gonna pick it up and talk about how we're applying this sort of idea in West Texas.
All right, great. Well, thanks, Joe, and thanks, Billy, for a nice introduction. And I also want to thank everybody who's tuning in to listen to this tonight. We appreciate your participation in it, and look forward to your questions and your comments about the Respect Big Bend project and process, and kind of where we are with things currently. So as Billy said, my role in the project, I'm basically a consultant to the Cynthia and George Mitchell Foundation, and I'm working with them through my appointment at the UT Law School. But my role in the project is kind of to manage all the various partners that are involved in this thing, and I'm going to tell you who they are in just a minute, and kind of make sure that we stay on track and that we keep moving forward. So anyway, I've got sort of the bird's eye view of this. Joe is much more the expert on the development by design process, and as you can see, has a tremendous amount of experience in using that process very successfully around the world. So just a little bit of background on this. I started working with the Mitchell Foundation back in 2016, I guess, and my initial assignment, I was working with Mary Lou Hastings, who was one of the speakers at the last spring seminar, the only one we've been able to do in person, was to help her strategize about how to empower the communities in West Texas that were sort of faced with very rapid energy development. And the backdrop of this was Apache Oil and Gas had just announced this very significant new oil and gas find in the Alpine High in southern Reeves County. It was a part of the state that I think many of us who have worked on energy issues for a long time were really surprised to hear that there might be recoverable oil and gas out there. And immediately there was some concern, not about Apache per se, because Apache's a terrific company, and I think everybody had faith that they would try to develop that resource in a good, environmentally sound way, but just kind of what that type of development might mean in a region that really had not experienced intense oil and gas drilling up to that point. So anyway, that was the genesis of the Mitchell Foundation's interest. And we started thinking about, sort of what might the foundation be able to fund that would again empower those communities to participate in any decisions that might be made about how that development takes place. And we ran across Joe's book, both read the book, and which is actually quite a good read, even if you're not an energy nerd like Mary Lou and I are, and decided, hey, this development by design process might make a tremendous amount of sense for West Texas and for the Big Bend region. So the Mitchell Foundation went on to fund the Nature Conservancy as well as BRI, TALT, the Texas Agricultural Land Trust, the Bureau of Economic Geology from UT, which has a tremendous amount of expertise on, well, they're geologists, but they have a tremendous amount of expertise on oil and gas operations and oil and gas reserves. And then also the Environmental Defense Fund, Senator Kip Averett, former State Senator Kip Averett, is part of our process. He's our kind of resident policy expert, and then also a very fine communications firm called Hudson Pacific. So I'm not going to go into detail, although I'm happy to answer questions later. But one of the things that Hudson Pacific did early on was a survey and some focus groups of folks out in West Texas to try to gauge, that part of the state, kind of what their reactions to this energy development that was proposed were and what their concerns might be, and also to kind of get a feel for, as we're thinking about shaping this process, what might we do that would actually be well received and would be constructive out in that region. So let's move on to the next slide. All right, so I always have to say just a little bit about the Cynthia and George Mitchell Foundation, because as I said at the beginning, they came up with this idea for Respect Big Bend and have invested a significant amount of money in the project. George Mitchell, if for anyone who does not know, he's I think referred to as the grandfather of fracking, something like that. He was a geologist and petroleum engineer, and he was the first person to sort of figure out how to combine hydraulic fracturing with horizontal drilling and recover oil and gas from very, very tight formations. He did that in the Barnett Shale outside of Fort Worth. Very successful businessman, but also very committed to sustainable development, and made a number of investments in actual sustainable developments around the country, like the Woodlands outside of Houston and a place called Bald Head Island off the coast of North Carolina. And always felt like he had a special responsibility to sort of push the oil and gas industry to do things as sustainably as possible. He certainly was an advocate for oil and gas development. He didn't oppose development, but he really felt like it was appropriate for his foundation to push the industry to try to do it as cleanly and sustainably as possible. So that's a little bit about his commitment to this. We're fortunate now to also have some terrific financial support from the Meadows Foundation, from the Stillwater Foundation, and from the Permian Basin Area Foundation, all of whom have supported the RBB project. So let's move on. All right, so Respect Big Bend, I've already told you who the kind of support team or the Mitchell grantees consist of. The TNC, TALT, BRI, Bureau of Economic Geology, Hudson Pacific, KIP Averett, and EDF. And our kind of the first thing that we did as a group, once the initial team was formed, was to come up with a mission for this project. And so let's move on to the mission statement. And this is what we came up with: to inspire and empower all stakeholders to conserve the unique resources and protect iconic communities of the greater Big Bend region while developing energy responsibly. And a couple of the aspects of the mission statement I just want to highlight. One is that the mission statement was meant to embody this idea that this process is about empowering the local communities. It's not about us, some sort of amorphous group of policy wonks and scientists kind of coming up with what we think would be appropriate for West Texas. Rather, it's about providing the tools and some technical expertise to people out in West Texas, listening to the community and to the stakeholders out there, and then trying to provide some tools and some ideas about ways that that region can be developed responsibly. The other thing I want to emphasize is this is not about stopping energy development. Now it turns out, and I'm going to talk about this in a little bit, there's not a tremendous imminent threat of energy development, especially oil and gas, in the Tri-County area, which is our initial focus. But in any event, there's a lot of energy development occurring in the Permian and in West Texas, and this project is not in some way designed to stop that. We do hope, however, that as a result of this effort, going forward, there will be a smaller footprint, a much more sort of sustainable future for the region, and not as much environmental harm and sort of community harm as some areas have experienced up to this point. Let's move on. Yeah, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but again, this sort of support group that was funded by Mitchell at the outset identified these 4 principles as being the guiding principles for our overarching project. The importance of inclusivity to make sure that we're actually hearing from, again, the stakeholders in the region. But, you know, and those stakeholders are going to include business owners, but also ordinary citizens and religious leaders and community policy level, you know, county judges and city council members, et cetera, landowners out there certainly, as well as industry. Again, one of the things we can bring to this, to this kind of question, I guess, is information. You know, the projections on energy development, which the Bureau of Economic Geology is developing, as well as information about the potential impacts of energy development to the region. So part of our role is to provide that information to the stakeholders. Through access to expertise, we've got some amazing experts on our team, and we kind of see our role as serving those stakeholders and providing access to those expertise, and then an ongoing engagement process. So even after this tri-county focus that I'm going to talk about in the next slide is completed, we want to remain available for landowners and community leaders and others in industry, for that matter, out in the region. And make the tools that we're developing available to them. So next slide. So a little bit about the stakeholder engagement process. And again, this certainly comes from the development by design template, which is, as Joe is saying, very much grounded in the idea that it's the community's role to identify the values that they care the most about, and for whatever sort of conservation plan is developed from that to reflect those community values. So it comes from the development by design process, but it also comes from decades of experience in all sorts of settings, right? Conservation settings, social justice settings, where long-lasting results or improvements in the way things are done have to be generated from the grassroots, from the communities that are affected. So that's, again, the foundation of this whole process. A lot of the work that we've done with our stakeholder advisory group over the last year and a half or so has been around working with that group to identify the values that are most important to the Big Bend region. So that's the foundation. The potential impacts would come, again, from projections of energy development in the region, and that's BEG's responsibility, and they're bringing those estimates back to the SAG. And then the ideas about mitigation strategies or ways to minimize those impacts or restore or offset those impacts, those ideas also would come from that stakeholder advisory group. Our stakeholder advisory group out in the region, it took us, a while, a number of months to put that group together. BRI deserves the credit for that, but we listened to a lot of different folks about who the right individuals would be and wanted to make sure we had the right constituencies represented. And we think our stakeholder advisory group is just phenomenal. We've got landowners, we have community members, business owners, religious leaders, local policymakers, conservation groups, and also industry represented on that SAG. And so it's just been an amazingly constructive group, and we're really, really grateful for their participation in this. So next slide. So our stakeholder advisory group consists of representatives from these 3 counties, the highlighted area, Jeff Davis, Presidio, and Brewster counties. But I did want to mention that the scientific work that we're doing, the mapping and the layering that I'll show you an example of in a minute, and the projections of energy development actually cover a much larger region. So they cover this entire 18-county Trans-Pecos region. And that's interesting, obviously, and for anybody who's participating tonight, you might have an interest in one of the other counties, but it's also, as we look forward to what happens after this stakeholder engagement process, the first phase of that is complete in the Tri-County area, we will have the foundational information we need in a much larger geographic area to take this process and expand it north. So we can move on. I don't think I need to belabor this. I've already alluded to it. These are the 3 different kind of areas of activity that the Mitchell Foundation and our other funders are supporting. You know, there's the science-based underpinnings of everything we do, both on the energy projection side as well as the sort of conservation mapping side, providing that technical support to landowners and communities, and then doing a lot of outreach with other constituencies that aren't members of the SAG, but that have an interest in what the SAG produces. And BRI is the lead on that and has done just, again, phenomenal work in making sure that all the stakeholders out in that region are informed. All right, next slide. All right, so Joe's already showed you this slide that lays out the development by design key steps. In the Respect Big Bend project in the Tri-County area, we are on we're working on those first 3 steps there. So the conservation vision, again, has been informed by the SAG, and I'm going to show you just a real quick example of what the map layers look like and what the values that our SAG have articulated are. The Bureau of Economic Geology is projecting the future development, both of oil and gas, and then also of renewables and associated infrastructure like transmission lines and pipelines, that kind of thing. The impacts will be essentially where those first 2 things collide or overlap. So we'll be able to identify places where there might be conflicts, or where, another way to put it would be where future development might impact one of the values that the Stakeholder Advisory Group has identified. And the next step for us will be devising a sort of suite of potential mitigation actions to reduce those impacts, to make sure landowners are made whole, and that landowners have the information they need when they make decisions about whether to sign a contract with an energy company and that kind of thing. And implicit in all this, again, this probably goes without saying, is that the normal way that energy is developed in Texas, as well as, you know, the rest of the United States, essentially on private land, is that the energy companies work directly with the landowners. There is not, you know, there's not a lot of regulatory approval, and that's not going to change anytime soon. There's certainly not community involvement in those decisions. So we can't change that framework, nor we necessarily want to, but we want to make sure it's as informed as possible with all of these pieces of information. All right, just a little bit more, and I'm about ready to turn it back over to Joe. Just quickly, these are the values that our Stakeholder Advisory Group has identified for the Tri-County area. You know, first and foremost, ranching, heritage, and private property. And you can see the rest, the view sheds and vistas, the dark skies, ecotourism and hunting, some of the natural resources that provide habitat for species out there. And then the community and culture piece, which as our Stakeholder Advisory Group has described that, it's really just, you know, the sense of community that people feel, their affinity to being in a small town, that rural feeling that comes along with being out in this region. All right, next slide. Yeah, so TNC, which has just amazing technical capacity and very, very smart GIS experts on staff, is taking those values that I just showed you on the previous slide and representing those spatially in GIS map layers. So I'm not going to delve into the details of what's on these maps, but they're using, in some cases, surrogates for those values. There's not a map that exists anywhere of a dark sky, for example. So rather than try to find some reference to that, the a spatial representation of dark skies would be one that that highlights places that are not impacted by light pollution currently, right? Like by cities or by industrial development or what have you. So this piece is the stakeholder advisory group is going to review. They've seen a couple of versions of the maps that we've been producing, and we've had a lot of back and forth with them about the accuracy of the maps, what the maps contain, etc. And they'll see a close to final version of maps in a couple of weeks at our next stakeholder advisory group meeting. And we just have one last thing, which Joe is going to touch on, and then we'll move on to next steps and questions.
Sure. Great. So this is really just a cartoon example of how some of those data layers could be used. There's a variety of different data inputs, but at the end we summarize that into a single metric. It's a continuous metric from 0 to 100, and so you can look at, this is just a random place on the landscape, and we put in, a fictitious transmission line. I am always careful to make that really clear, since we're just, meant to be illustrative here. And you can actually, if you look at it, you can actually see that first proposed transmission line bisects some of these really high value areas. One simple application of this might be to use those conservation values and that cumulative score to cite that an alternative pathway in ways that reduces its impacts to some of those conservation values. And so just provided sort of two examples, and you can kind of see they went through darker areas, which are higher values, into lower areas, which are lighter values, in two different ways that could happen. There are a myriad of ways I think this data can be used. It's really important. We're not decision makers. We are information providers. And I think a good product will have applications that we're not even thinking about right now, but just wanted to give some sense of how the information system could be used. Turn it back to you, Linda.
Yeah, and just super quickly, because we want to have as much time as possible for questions, but in terms of what's next, we are on track, we think, to finalize the initial phase of our Tri-County work with our stakeholders by the end of this year. That's our goal. To have a final report with our conclusions and recommendations that the stakeholder advisory group wants to make with respect to that information. The next phase would be to look north into a broader geographic area. Reeves County, Pecos, Culberson County are all in Hudspeth County are all sort of hotspots for energy development of various sorts. Assuming we have the funding support and that there's interest from the stakeholders, we would like to stand up another stakeholder advisory group, one or more in those counties, to try to expand the footprint of what we're doing. We're also contemplating, and again, this is dependent on having adequate funding, but expanding the sort of subject matter scope of the project to include a look at economic development. A lot of the small towns in West Texas, not so much in the Tri-County area, but towns like Pecos and even Midland or Odessa, they're really buffeted by the whole boom and bust cycle that comes along with oil and gas development. And we have some ideas about how that kind of wild swing of boom and bust might be mitigated somewhat by facilitating some more economic development planning at the community level. So anyway, those are just to give you a sense of what we're looking at down the road. And with that, I think I'll stop and look forward to hearing questions from folks.
Great. I'm going to stop sharing my computer and kick it back to you, Billy, to take us away.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Melinda. We've got a few questions. Appreciate those coming in. If you have some, be sure and ask them. One of our first questions is, are there specific exploration and production companies that stand out as exemplary for other companies to emulate? Thanks. Melinda, can I ask you to address that possibly? Or?
Yeah, and I'm not. That's a tricky question. I'm not an expert on every company by any means. I mean, I will say that both Concho and Apache, both of which are participating in our stakeholder advisory group, they have, at least with respect to this issue of being open to ideas about how to minimize their energy footprint and reduce the environmental impacts of their development, they've both been very cooperative and really, really constructive members of our SAG, and I think their commitment is sincere. There are a number of really good companies out there, so it's hard to, it's hard to single folks out, but my sense is that generally the kind of pretty healthy mid-sized companies to larger companies, they have the resources to spend on environmental conservation, so they tend to be better actors than some of the really small companies that may not have the technical expertise or the kind of capital that's required to minimize their impacts.
Am I back on?
You are.
Thank you, Melinda. Got another question here, and it asked, "Who are the SAG members?" I'll go ahead and address that quickly. We don't have complete permission exactly at this point as far as individuals. We're kind of working through some of that as we move through this process. Obviously, we've built a lot of trust with these individuals, and I think that almost all of them are willing to share their names. But that said, we're just now at the point where we're beginning to show some of these spatial projections, and the next few SAG meetings are going to be crucial that we have that they're comfortable with this process, because we want them to be. We are optimistic that whatever we produce as far as a report, they'll be comfortable with as well. But I don't want to go ahead and mention names at this time, because I can't mention all names. I can tell you that the representatives, it's very heavy on area landowners, respected area landowners, for obvious reasons. We want to be sure and be mindful of private property rights and the fact that we're not trying to do anything to upset private property rights. It's heavy on community members, community leaders, as Melinda said, and religious leaders, oil and gas representatives, energy representatives, and who am I missing? Or conservation organizations. We didn't get too big of a group, and that was another question that actually came in, how we pick these folks. I think Melinda mentioned that a while ago. It was a laborious process for Dr. Lewis Harbison and I. We've both been out here a long time, knew a lot of folks, networked with a lot of folks, got recommendations. Just really tried to handpick those individuals that we felt could come to the table and represent values of all of y'all out there in the Tri-County area. And what's funny about that is a lot of those folks typically are very busy. They're asked to do a lot. They may be county commissioners. They may be sit on a lot of different organizations. And as busy as they were, not a single one turned us down. They all thought this was important, and they all committed to it, and it has been a very, very good process. So, got another one here. How applicable is this process in a private land state where oil and gas is so dominating? I think that maybe should go to Joe, or do you want it to be Joe?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the science and analysis work can be done anywhere, right? So we can really understand what those values are. We can map them. We can project future development patterns, and we can understand how those things might intersect or might impact. The harder part would be, what are the solutions that you have to provide alternative development plans or ways to mitigate those that might be thinking outside the box? I think that's the one really big challenge. I think what we, and I've worked in places where private land was the primary land tenure. I think there are a variety of ways, and the first step is to show that, one, the community as a whole is behind this sort of vision for conservation. And I say conservation is probably not the right necessarily the word, because we're not talking about protection at all, or anything that somebody in a conservation organization might immediately go to. We're really just talking about what do they want this place to look like in 30, 40, 50 years, right? And it's that vision that if the community is really secure around that, then I think strategies to achieve that, where they may be in conflict, come out of some of those, that collective reckoning of the conservation vision. You know, I don't want to say what I think are the tools that are in the toolbox, but you know, if the community as a whole says, hey, we really value these places, and recognize that they're privately owned, you know, maybe there's some way to use tools like easements to compensate landowners for not losing or developing those values, or losing those values through a development, you know, so that the development shifts and goes somewhere else into an area that as a whole doesn't have some of those high conservation value areas. There's I think a variety of ways to address it. But at first, again, the first step is, what do we care about? Where is it? What is development likely to go? And not all forms of development are going to impact those conservation values. That's another really important point. And we don't just start out with the development is going to create these impacts. We really have to work through these steps. I think that's really important.
Yeah, can I add one thing to that too, Billy? Which is that, you know, I think in our experience, most energy company, well, all energy companies would prefer to avoid a lot of conflict, right? They don't want to try to develop a new field or build a new solar plant or wind farm in the face of a lot of opposition, whether it's from the community or from, you know, environmental groups or what have you. And so, but what's development by design, this sort of process is a way that the companies can learn what's important to that community, you know, and it won't be kind of a, as Joe said at the beginning, sort of a site by site, you know, one step at a time kind of thing to try to minimize the impacts on a particular ranch, but it can be a little bit broader in scope and in thought. And so, you know, hopefully it'll be a tool that the energy industry itself will find useful.
Thank you, both of y'all. Thank you for that. I see Joe's answering some questions. I don't know if those are getting published or not. Can everybody see those? Okay, about dark skies. Joe did a good job of answering that as well. Here's one: is solar development getting more interest than wind these days, and why? And would that be a Melinda question? Oh, by the way, I'm sorry to interrupt, Melinda. I wanted to be sure I missed something a while ago. We were supposed to have another participant on the panel. We typically have at least one or two SAG members on the panel when we do these seminars, and our participant this evening is having technical difficulties and will not be able to participate.
Oh no.
So we're going to go ahead and allow that individual the opportunity to participate in the future. They're not off the hook yet. They're coming back, and they'll be at a future. And I'm not naming any names, but they'll be at a future webinar. So anyway, just want to let y'all know about that. But we try to have a SAG participant on every single one of our webinars, and we will at the next one for sure. So go ahead, Melinda.
Yeah, so the question of solar and versus wind. So I think probably everybody realizes Texas has substantially more wind development than any other state in the country, right? I think we're up to 26,000 or 27,000 megawatts of wind. In West Texas, though, especially in the Permian Basin area, as I understand it, it's some of the best solar resource in the world. And there's a huge amount of planned solar investment and solar farms that are currently under construction in Pecos County and Reeves County and that whole part of the Trans-Pecos. Now, interestingly, some of that solar is being driven by demand from the oil and gas sector. So companies up in the Permian Basin are looking to and have supported the development of new solar farms a little bit south of there to power their oil and gas operations, all the equipment on oil and gas sites, which I find super interesting. But we're also seeing a fair amount of new solar going in to support things like Facebook and Google and that kind of thing. These solar farms that are developed for one corporate consumer. That's sort of a growing market all over the country, but especially in Texas. And so we have actually recently brought in another expert who's really an expert on the renewables field generally, but especially on solar development. And he and a colleague are doing some kind of interesting modeling to see what we might project in West Texas for solar development in particular. Wind is a little bit, at least in the Trans-Pecos region, there's not, as we understand it, a lot of new wind on the drawing board at this point. But there is a lot of projected new solar development out there.
Thank you, Melinda. I hate to come back to you again, but the next question I have here is Apache seems to have abandoned the Alpine High area with a turnover in geo leadership. Is this good news for the region? There's a question for you.
Right. Well, yeah, so that was interesting, right? A few months ago, Apache announced that they were not going to pursue the development of the Alpine High, and they sort of retracted a lot of or just announced that a lot of their early projections about the size of the reserves and et cetera in that part of Reeves County were not going to come to fruition, which was interesting and was somewhat surprising to a lot of us. Whether or not it's good news, I mean, it takes some of the immediate pressure off of, because before they made that announcement, we were watching and projecting some really rapid development of that part of the county. And I think, you know, as I said at the very beginning, that was one of the things that spurred the creation of this whole program was, you know, how do we kind of make sure that the region is prepared for that level of industrial type development? So it does give everybody a breather, but, you know, that's not to say that that resource won't ultimately be developed. And, you know, at the end of the day, it may not be developed by a company with as much, you know, sort of corporate responsibility as Apache has. So, you know, we'll have to see. But I think at a minimum, it kind of gives everybody some breathing space to think about, you know, like, is there a way to look at that Alpine High and figure out, you know, if it's going to be developed somewhere down the line, if it does become economical again and profitable to do that, how might it be done in a way that would minimize the environmental impacts associated with development? So that's not a very clear answer, but I think it's kind of a mixed bag.
Better than I could have done. Well done. You know, I'm gonna pick on you a little bit. There was a slide that's, and we may have already addressed this somewhat, but there was a slide that said mitigation strategies. What would that include?
Wow, it's a great question. I mean, I think it could include anything that you do that is a conservation intervention that's done in the landscape. You know, somebody who thinks about mitigation a lot, which is sad, I guess. But you know, there's the steps of the mitigation hierarchy from avoid to minimize to restore and offset. Avoidance is typically something where we say we're just not going to develop there, right? So we're going to avoid that impact. Minimization can be a myriad of things, from the way a road network is designed to the activity on the road, to the way the footprint is you know, a big one that's a really effective minimization tool with oil and gas is to use these drilling mats, where they put it out over the vegetation while they have intensive activity. They pull those mats off after, and the vegetation survives, a little damaged in some cases, but it's back as opposed to sort of clearing the area. That's a minimization technique. If they've created an impact on site, restoration, revegetating the area, and then compensation are actions that take place away from where the impact has occurred, that are intended to balance out. Where you have an impact, can you actually do something beneficial offsite to add some additional value? And then, you know, I think there are also other ways to think about this, where we look at, you know, that alternative siting of where the energy infrastructure comes into play. Those are super effective ways, not stopping it, but just saying, hey, let's be really conscious of the big picture of that footprint. Another really super, in some ways, simple to say, maybe harder to do, is if you have a big energy play, we have multiple developers, is co-designing their footprints, right? So the way it tends to happen now is the operators, this is wind, solar, oil and gas, and I've seen this across the board. They don't talk to each other, right? So they both need a haul road to bring equipment and things in and out, and so they both develop one. And so just little sort of things like that, where you can step back a little bit, can have dramatic positive impacts on how things move forward.
Excellent. Thank you, Joe. I think we're about out of time. We're at 7:31. And still getting a few questions coming in. If we have some that we can, we'll post those. Hopefully, if you have some more, keep submitting those. We're going to give you all the rest of your evening back. Hopefully, this was a informative and educational opportunity for you. We appreciate our presenters so much. Joe and Melinda, you did a great job. I want to remind y'all of our next seminar upcoming. It's the landowners, energy development and conflict, finding common ground. That's going to be a very good one. We are looking forward to that quite a bit, kind of taking it from the statewide level down to the more of the opportunity from conservation organizations level down to the actual ranch level. So how we can work with energy companies, how landowners can work with energy company to find common ground and minimize impacts. Obviously, some of those, many of those recommendations will be taken into account as we move forward to Respect Big Bend and working with our landowner partners. So I guess that's it, and I'm going to sign off now. We appreciate y'all and look forward to seeing you on October 8th, and thank you so much.
Thanks, Billy. Bye,
Yeah,
everybody.
thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.